Good evening. I want to welcome you to the university on this special occasion, the Robert Wood Lecture. And I think it's particularly appropriate that this lecture be associated with the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a public university, a research university, a student-centered university. It is also appropriate that it came into being in the 1960s when Robert Wood had some special days, and that we can commemorate his being with us, being part of this Commonwealth and this country, in the presence of members of his family, Peggy, I saw, and Fanny, and then tonight we're going to have the distinguished lecturer, a member of the family. I emphasized urban because I had come to know Robert Wood when I joined this university and had a number of conversations with him. And I've thought of him in a number of ways, which are defining of this university as it is and what it aspires to be. The urban. He did not see the urban as a dying place, laden with social pathologies. It was a site of tomorrow, complex, but it was going to be the seat of many tomorrows. He saw it in the context of what we would today call intersectionality, that life proceeds. It resides at intersections of race, gender, class, nationality, at the intersections of knowledge, politics, policy, people, at the intersections of disciplines. We speak of interdisciplinarity today as part of defining of our university curricular offerings. Before we had those terms so popularly, Bob embodied them. The translational, another intersection, where the highly abstract and the theoretical meets the world of practice, each seeking to refine the other. Bob was a public intellectual, not in the Gramscian sense, except he was in fact the organic intellectual in the sense of his own consciousness and what emanated from his being. But he did not think of the public intellectual as a sort of clergy, a select group of academicians divorced from practice. It was going to be someone who recognized the urban space not simply as a physical one, but as one that embodied particular ethos, particular frameworks for proper analyses, captured paradox, and one had to be able to hold a paradox in oneself. It was the site of a variety of modes of imagining. I will dare to say he was an idealist. You may not think of it in that way, but he saw work and education as something that could bring all of the human faculties in play within the complexity of the urban. And that inclusion, long before that became popular also, would be defining attribute of the urban. In closing, I'll quote Langston Hughes. Oh yes. I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath. America will be. I think Bob, in his focus on the urban, with the attributes just mentioned, envisioned as an idealist also, that America will be. Welcome.
That soaring rhetoric is always hard to follow. I'm David Cash. I'm the Dean of the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, and it is such a wonderful pleasure to be here. And I gotta say, I've only been in this job for about 8 months, and I love my job. I have a day of where I'm working with faculty to hire new faculty. I'm working with staff at the various research centers that are trying to leverage their research to help communities in Boston or help communities around the globe. And then I get to come to this lecture, listen to our distinguished lecturer, Governor Hassan, talking about public service to honor her father, Bob Wood, who, unlike many in this room, I never knew, didn't know much about, but as I've learned about him, what the quintessential public servant, working at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, in academia, in high school. I mean, it's just remarkable, just remarkable. What an inspiration he must have been to you, because I know he's been a huge inspiration to all of us in this room. That is why we are here, and that is why we honor him every year with this series of lectures. And as the provost was talking about, this kind of link of kind of the mission, the passionate mission with the academic work, that's something that we're all about here at UMass Boston and all about here in the McCormick School as well. And certainly, for the school's namesake, for John W. McCormick, that's what this was all about. And I want, as part of welcoming you and connecting John W. McCormick with Bob Wood and with the governor, here's a short quote of his. He said in a House speech in 1959, "I'm concerned with those who will come after me. The kind of world they're going to live in is dependent on the soundness of judgment of those in positions of responsibility and how courageous they are in carrying out their policies." That's a call to all of us who are interested in studying policy, in doing policy, in living policy. And so I welcome you to this evening of doing all of those things, of thinking about how we can courageously move forward. And certainly our speaker tonight has had that courage to take policy and move it in a way that affects people's lives in fundamental ways. So welcome everybody and enjoy the evening.
You're next. Good evening. I'm Bob Turner, the chair of the Wood Visiting Professor Committee. My job tonight is to get you as quickly as possible to the people you really want to hear from. But first, just a bit of continuity. I bring greetings from David's predecessors, Steve Crosby and Ira Jackson, and from Associate Dean Connie Chan, all of whom are great fans of this event and of the family over time, but could not be with us tonight for various reasons. Connie, for instance, is at a conference in Hong Kong. Couldn't get here tonight. Second, a grateful nod to Rochelle Brown and her team, Shalia Rather, Barbara Graceffa, and several other volunteers who, without whom really we couldn't make these events possible. Everybody's spending. And third, a quick shout out to the Wood Committee, and particularly the irrepressible Peggy. I don't know why anybody would even think of trying to repress Peggy, but she is certainly irrepressible. Would the committee members here please stand up and be acknowledged? It's really a great pleasure working with them, and we've had some good time over the years. Peggy, you've got some, where's Michael? Anyway, there's some others. So Michael, anyway. Also I wanted to recognize, since they're all here, Peggy and Bob's other progeny, Franny, who nearly always joins us, and Frank, who never has. I don't believe. Frank is an actor based in New York and usually can't get here because he is performing or rehearsing or something or other, but we managed to extricate himself tonight for a special reason. Now for the main course. Your program contains essential biographies of Governor Hassan, of your programs, of Shelley Metzenbaum and David Cash, who will respond to her talk, and also of the late Bob Wood, whom this professorship honors. The program doesn't make a connection that's actually quite obvious. These are four of the most committed implementers of modern times. Together, they can claim stacks of advanced degrees. Their academic credentials are solid. But not one of them would be happy to be known as a theorist alone. They are all about making public higher education more effective and affordable, about providing clean energy, about inspiring public support for government policies that work, and yes, about making the trains run on time. Shelley has been doing outstanding work at the OMB and now at the Volcker Alliance, but we remember her best for building the Collins Center here and for her own Wood lecture here in 2013 when she was the visiting professor and one of her panelists was Governor Hassan. David's first few months as Dean of the McCormick School have already invigorated students, faculty, and staff alike with new energy and more ambitious horizons that I think you got a glimpse of just now. Bob Wood felt clearly a deep affection for McCormick. Late in his career, well after his 7-year tenure as president of the University of Massachusetts and his other public jobs, Wood left a prestigious professorship at Wesleyan and returned to what was then the McCormick Institute as a visiting fellow himself beginning in 1994. As McCormick has grown from an institute to a full-fledged graduate school granting multiple degrees and graduate certificates, we've been fortunate to retain the relationship with the Wood family, including its most successful elected implementer, who has traveled south of her border. Do they know you were actually born here? To participate in this event year after year. I am delighted to introduce the 2016 Robert C. Wood Visiting Professor in Public and Urban Affairs, New Hampshire Governor Maggie Hassan.
Well, good evening, and Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bob Turner, for the introduction and for your kind words about my dad and my family. Provost Langley and Dean Cash, thank you for your welcomes as well. I join my mother and my sister and my brother in welcoming all of you. And I'd like to extend, in addition, my thanks to the University of Massachusetts and to the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, which does sound better than the McCormick Institute, not only for this remarkable evening every year, but also for carrying on the work that my father championed each and every day. Usually on this evening, I stand up here, I'm given a little bit of an opportunity just to welcome people. One year I got to be on the panel, but then I hand it over to a distinguished speaker for the keynote lecture. And when my staff first told me that I was invited to deliver the lecture tonight, my initial reaction was, but I'm not an academic. After all, I'm the daughter of Bob Wood, who, much to his dismay, went to law school. I went to law school for among other things, so I would never have to write a dissertation. So I have a little bit of a sense of irony standing here tonight delivering a lecture named for my father, truly a public intellectual, and truly someone who would have been the first person to remind me that I am not an academic. But while Dad certainly would have joked about the irony of my giving this lecture, the truth is that none of his work was academic to him. It was always about real people with real lives. The ideas that he worked on and thought through weren't just about understanding the political and policy dynamics affecting people's lives. Dad's work was always about finding ways to make people's lives better. While I may not have chosen to follow directly in my father's career path, there's no doubt that much of what guides my work, whether as a lawyer, a state senator, governor, or candidate for the United States Senate, comes from the example that my dad set, and from the very deep core values that he brought to this campus and to all the work that he did. First and foremost among those core values was always that in a democracy, everybody counts. And because everybody counts in a democracy, democracy must work to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to succeed, that everyone has the opportunity to work hard and raise a family and have an opportunity to climb the ladder of success. Dad also understood that in order to turn these values into reality, democracy itself must work. And the way you make democracy work is by realizing that if everybody counts, then everybody's opinions, ideas, and philosophies have values, have value, which means that there will be inevitable arguments, and also means you have to find your way through those disagreements, a process that at least some of the time gives rise to solutions. Well, that may be a concept that many pay lip service to, this notion that we should all share our ideas and have our arguments and work through them. What often gets lost in the conversation is another key principle that Dad taught and demonstrated. The idea that the political process is an enormously human one. That because everyone counts and has a voice, it is the very humanity of each and every participant that ultimately helps us make great strides, but also can create barriers that cause us to stumble. American politics is really just about group decision-making, where the group's bond is the mutual respect we have for each other as Americans, a respect that propels us to find a way forward, to find a solution that will help ensure that everybody has the opportunity to make progress and to be included in our shared success. It might be surprising to some to know that a man whose life work in both academia and public service was deeply rooted in the values of inclusion, expanding economic opportunity, and engaging with one another to ensure more vibrant lives and communities for all citizens, was actually raised in the segregated South. Growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, during the Great Depression, my father's father was a traveling shoe salesman, which meant his income plummeted during the Depression since people could forego shoes in the Deep South's warm climate. Through hard work, a scholarship, taking on jobs like waiting tables and moving furniture, and a bit of luck, my dad was able to attend Princeton. His studies were interrupted, however, when he left to volunteer to fight in World War II. Fighting in the European theater, he was eventually thrown into the Battle of the Bulge. Many remember the Battle of the Bulge as the tremendously brutal winter fight that was one of the bloodiest battles in our nation's history. It also, though, was historic for another reason. The Battle of the Bulge marked one of the first times in World War II that white and black American soldiers fought alongside each other. Thousands of miles away from the school where he had been studying, this young man from the Deep South found himself learning more about the values of equality and inclusion than he ever could have learned back home. And after my father's experience in this battle, where African American soldiers fought and died alongside their white counterparts, Dad returned home to a life of working to make the notion that everybody counts a reality. After being raised in a time and a place where the belief in true equality was not particularly common and certainly wasn't honored, he in many ways transcended the culture in which he was brought up. He was guided by the principle that you fight for your country abroad when you have to, on the battlefield when you must, but also at home, working with each other to expand opportunity and to improve lives. Dad was particularly focused on the needs of American cities, housing, and urban development, because he knew that the foundation for equality started with the basics of having a roof over your head and a livable community to call your own. His work led John F. Kennedy to seek his advice as Kennedy developed his vision for improving American cities. While Kennedy was running for president, Dad helped him craft a speech calling for the renewal of the country's urban housing system, specifically calling for building more low and middle-income homes and better supporting the needs of the elderly and minority groups. Dad knew that it was necessary to not only change our nation's laws, but also to rethink and remake the built structures that comprise our communities in order to build the ladders of opportunity that will allow all citizens the ability to work hard and to thrive. Later, serving in President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, my father recommended establishing the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And at that department, he served as the undersecretary to the first African American to be appointed to a cabinet-level position in the federal government since Reconstruction, Robert C. Weaver. At HUD, he worked to break down racial and economic barriers in America's housing policies, promote economic development, and implement landmark legislation, including helping to develop the Model Cities program to focus federal revenues on communities in need. He also worked to develop the Fair Housing Act of 1968, landmark civil rights legislation that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin in the rental or sale of housing. And as my father worked to further the values of freedom, equality, and inclusion every day, he and my mom made sure that their children would do the same. And I'd be remiss here if I didn't stop for a minute and talk about another critical bit of good fortune that my dad had, which was meeting and marrying my mother. Mom was Dad's best interpreter, best editor, and actually challenged him with true intellectual rigor at the dinner table on a regular occasion. Because, as you all heard, Dad was an idealist, and there were times when he would just want to move forward with something, and it took Mom to kind of say, hold on, are you sure that's really true? How can you prove that? So my mother was not only critical to Dad's success, but she also was a leader in our household by example. Being the president of our local League of Women Voters, my very first kind of political memory is collating documents at our dining room table that Mom was mailing out for the League of Women Voters. Later, she taught in our local high school, teaching me more about what it means to really mentor young people than from anyone else I've ever seen. My parents taught all three of us to be welcoming, to ask hard questions, but also to work hard to answer them, and to be of use. Wasn't just enough to think about helping or to theorize about it, but it was important to help, to be useful. Dad always liked it when we all ate breakfast as a family, which was kind of a running joke because we would all sit down and then he would immediately pick up the newspaper and kind of disappear behind it. But there was a breakfast or two, really more than that, when his newspaper would lower and he would ask us questions about our day. And from time to time, the question that he would ask was, what are you going to do for freedom today? That question, what are you doing for freedom today, has helped guide me ever since. If my work in public service was first inspired sitting at that breakfast table with Dad, it was then heightened 27 years ago when my husband Tom and I started our family. Tom and I have two terrific children, Ben and Meg. Ben, our firstborn, is a wonderful young man, if I do say so myself. But right after he was born, Tom and I learned that Ben had severe and pervasive physical disabilities. And it didn't take us long to understand that if Ben was going to have the kind of opportunities we all want our children to have, Tom and I were going to need some extra help. We were lucky because in our community in Exeter, New Hampshire, we found that network of help and support, from friends and neighbors to be sure, to our strong and loving family, yes, but also healthcare professionals, educators, a network of support that made it possible for Ben to live at home with us and to be included. Just about 25 years ago, coming up this fall, a school bus pulled into our driveway, and we wheeled Ben onto the lift, and up he went into the school bus, off to his first day of publicly funded preschool. I sat on our front stoop as the bus pulled away, thinking about the fact that had Ben been born a generation or two earlier, we would have been pressured to put him in an institution. There wouldn't have been the resources available to help us include Ben in our home, and there certainly wouldn't have been the resources in the public schools to include Ben as a student. That got me thinking about the work that had gone on before the Hassan family. The families before us, their advocates, and the public servants who engaged and listened to them and helped them, they were the reason that my son was having a chance to go to school in his hometown, where he would have the opportunity to learn and to make friends. That's, in essence, the story of who we are as a democracy, right? Every generation moving to include more and more people into the heart and soul of our democracy. But it was that morning, sitting there thinking about all the work that it took, that reminded me that we all have a responsibility to continue that work. throughout it all, my father was a steady presence. He had a warmth and a willingness to let Ben be Ben, and both he and my mother taught us that there wouldn't be a perfect way to ensure seamless inclusion for Ben. Dad let me know it was all right if it was hard to make some things work, that we'd have to make some trade-offs as we worked to do what was best for our son, and that there was nothing wrong with those trade-offs. Most of all, he taught me that inclusion isn't always easy. It's easy to say everybody counts and to mean it, but what can be hard is how you make it a reality, how you ensure that Ben or any child has the opportunities that all parents want for their kids. It wasn't just the lessons about the importance of inclusion that my father taught me as a kid, but also the lessons about the difficulty of inclusion that he helped me learn as an adult that have informed my life in public service. Like Dad, I've tried to work to bring people in from the margins into the heart and soul of our democracy, to build a future where all of our citizens have the opportunity to get ahead and stay ahead, where each generation is truly better off than the last. I like to think that the work my dad and mom did serves as the foundation of what I've set out to do as governor, fighting for priorities like expanding Medicaid to strengthen the health and financial well-being of hardworking New Hampshire families, working to pass Medicaid expansion through a Republican Senate, and then reauthorizing it with both a Republican House and Republican Senate was a constant reminder that the work of inclusion is hard. Making progress to include more people in our shared success truly requires us to set aside preconceived notions, to be rigorous in examining our own long-held positions, and to work to identify our common ground, and then when you do, to seize upon it. Whether it was working to pass and reauthorize Medicaid expansion, or to pass fiscally responsible budgets that invested in critical economic priorities, there have, of course, been times when negotiations grow pretty heated, and times when it seems like there can be no breaking the stalemate. Times when I'm reminded, as Dad taught me, that making democracy work and bringing people in from the margins can be incredibly difficult. And it's in these moments that I've drawn on the lessons that, as a professor, my father sought to impart on the final day of all of his government classes. In this final class, Dad tried to prepare his students for the reality that they would face in the political arena after getting their degrees. He essentially told his students that through all of their efforts, their victories and their defeats, that the best public servants know that their work is not about them. That with every step you take forward and every bill that is passed, there are always other forces at work and different power structures that you have to break through in order to keep moving forward. He stressed that it is critical to take the long view and to always remember that the success or failure of any particular effort isn't just about the policymaker or the specifics of a given bill. And he recognized the role of those outside of government in effecting real change and how they can help policymakers in the elected arena do their jobs and develop new ideas that can truly change lives. What matters, he emphasized, is the people who you are trying to engage with and the people whose lives you are trying to make a difference in. He encouraged his students and his children to never take things too personally, but also to never underestimate how valuable personal relationships and interactions are. Showing up, listening to people, connecting, and building consensus is how you get things done. These are lessons that Dad lived by, whether he was navigating city, state, or national politics, or the oftentimes more difficult politics of academia. And they are lessons that I draw on in my work, not as an academic, as he would be the first to remind you, but as someone who strives each and every day to carry on his work of ensuring that everybody counts. My father's life wasn't just dedicated to trying to bring change to some of our nation's most vulnerable and neglected places. His life story was a testament to the very notion that change is possible. That a boy raised in the segregated South can grow up to transcend the culture in which he was born, not only fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, but also fighting for fair housing and civil rights when he returned. Through his life, Dad worked to realize the vision of our nation's founders, who declared that everyone counts, though they, of course, didn't count everyone at first. They had faith, though, that we'd continue striving to build a more perfect union, each generation of us. That was my father's life work, and it is work that everyone in this room carries on today. My dad once wrote that we need truly effective public action to meet the needs and injustices our country is, even today, still burdened with. And that's exactly what each one of us must do. We need to rededicate ourselves to promoting a democracy that works and that continues our forward march of progress to build a more perfect union. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I really look forward to continuing with our panel discussion.
Does that work? Yeah.
Well, I'm going
All right, all right. Okay.
Just as we're getting organized here, what's going to happen is I hope we'll get a little bit of a discussion going, so we can let Governor Hassan sit down, and there'll be some questions and comments from Shelley and David and responses from the governor, and I hope there'll be a little bit of a conversation among the three of them, and then we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A from the audience. I just can't resist saying, though, as we get organized, as the governor was talking about her mother's response to some of her father's ideas. I happen to be looking in one of Bob Wood's books today, and in the dedication, it talks about his family, all of his family, giving him a sense of proportion sometimes, but supporting all of his decisions, even if not with great sanguinity all the time, as to what the final result would be. Anyway, it was a terrific talk. Thanks very much, Governor. And Shelley, start us off, and then we'll go to Q&A after a little while.
So thank you, Governor. The first time I heard you speak, I sat there and just said, where did this woman come from who can look at history, look at philosophy, look at experience, and talk about it and feel it in such a tangible way that connects to people? And to hear you today lay out this magnificent vision of what we want to be and who we want to be. I mean, public intellectual you are. Freedom, equality, inclusion. Be of use. What are you going to do for freedom today? The lessons you've shared just inspire me, and I hope and assume they inspire everyone here. I will start with a question, in part because I've been asked to start with a question, but mostly I just want to digest what you've said and really think about it, because I think it is so needed, so visionary at this time. Right now, I would say there's a mood of pessimism that characterizes the country. And I know that, in fact, getting young people inspired to want to serve in government is challenging, especially with this mood of pessimism, of cynicism. How do you think about that as you lead a government agency and hopefully will serve in any legislative body?
Well, thank you for the question. And one of the students I met with earlier asked some of the same question as well. One of the things that I hope people can take from those of us who work in the public sector is that there are an awful lot of people, whether in elected office or appointed office, working in service, who are working together, making progress for real people, working with stakeholders, with the people in their communities and in their state to get things done. And I hope that people will understand and get to know some public servants, because when you do, and when you talk to somebody who does this work, as I get the opportunity to talk to so many New Hampshire public servants each and every day, you begin to realize that there are a lot of good things happening. The other thing that is important in public life, and I think that it's, well, it's an opportunity I wish more people had, is that I get the opportunity to travel around my state and talk to the people of my state. You know, I'm not giving away any big secrets. The New Hampshire governor and her security detail travel in a minivan, occasionally a Chevy Tahoe. But we get to, you know, I can stop at a Dunkin' Donuts and just start talking to people. And when you do, you realize how generous people are with their descriptions of what their lives are like and what they care about, what they think you should do to solve a particular problem. You're also reminded, whether it's you visit with an individual or a business owner, that the people that you represent solve problems in their daily lives all the time. And they do it generally without regard to political parties or difference, and they find a way forward. And so I think for elected leaders, one of the things to do is to just follow that example and remind each other that that's the example we were elected to follow. And when you do that, good things can happen. I do think in this very difficult electoral season, you know, we are seeing a real difference between the parties, not just in terms of policy prescriptions, but in terms of a basic understanding of the need to work together to get difficult things done. And the reminder that Americans are supposed to do difficult things. I mean, the whole founding of our country was a difficult thing. When you look at what we're charged to do, both in the Declaration and in the Constitution, those are really difficult things. But we have been rising to the occasion over a trajectory. And so the last thing I would say is just for people to remember the long view. That's what that day sitting on the stoop watching my son go off to school reminded me of. You know, that 30 years earlier, it wouldn't really have happened that way. And so as frustrating as of managing Ben's special needs could at times be, you know, managing the system, so to speak, understanding how far we have come is a really important thing, and I hope young people will think about it, and I hope young people will also remember that while service, whether it's in the public arena or not, whether it's elected or not, is very important, that you can make a difference by serving as an elected leader or in government at a much bigger scale than you can do in a singular effort, you know, volunteering. It's not that the second isn't important, and we all rely on that too. The ripple effect of all those volunteers is huge. But the key to a democracy is that we do things to help everybody have opportunity, and we do it for people we've never met and we never will know. And that's what distinguishes us. So those are some of the things I'd say. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you. That was, like Shelley, the first time that I heard you, I was completely inspired, particularly about how you link the kind of the lofty goals of governance and democracy with the on-the-ground reality of people. And that was this evening. That's the first time I heard you.
Thank you.
And here's a I actually have a couple of questions. And my first, I'm totally intrigued by your father's question at the breakfast table. As a father of trying to get kids to think beyond themselves in a larger context, in a larger work, to inspire them. So, and now that your siblings are here too, maybe they'll be dragged into this. What were your answers to that question?
I think I really...
What you're doing about
for-
freedom.
For a moment, just hoped Dad would go back to reading the newspaper, because it seemed like quite a, you're in fourth grade. What are you supposed to do for freedom today, right? So it was a rhetorical question, to be sure, at the table, but it did get us thinking. And I saw my siblings whispering, so I don't know if they remember the same thing at the breakfast table. But I do think it always came down to just making sure that we were observing the dynamics and the people around us and trying to make sure that we were being fair.
Right. I would have. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, so Governor, I just want to pick up, you talked a bit about, what, I have to turn something
Closer.
on?
I think a little closer. Just closer.
Okay. You talked about how it's very important to volunteer and serve, but also you can serve in government where you can leverage your capacity perhaps more.
Right.
One of the things I find when you're working in government is you come up with ideas, you come up with plans, you come up with laws that get passed. And then the challenge is to make them actually work the way you want them to work.
Yeah.
And to get the people who are implementing them, so when you're governor, it's your leadership team, but actually it's all the career employees.
Right.
Where complying with the letter of the law or the intent of the law tends to take over and overwhelm getting the law to actually deal with the reasons you created it.
Right.
Any suggestions, any thoughts about how to deal with that?
One of the things that happens in New Hampshire, because again, it's small and we can talk to each other easily, is that you work to make sure that as you're implementing the law, when you see there are problems with it, you go ahead and file an amendment to the law for the next legislative session and adjust. And that's one of the things that I, again, would hope that all members of the public, all of our constituents, would think about sometimes, which is that the job of governing is a job of setting out your goals, passing laws to achieve those goals, implementing the laws, and then making course corrections as you go, because that's the way you solve any problem. And it is the process of those, you need to have confidence that the course corrections are possible. You also need to have an engagement between the legislative branch and the executive branch so that your public servants in the executive branch are coming back and saying, hey, I know you guys meant this. This is how it's actually working. And the other reason it's important is that sometimes I think what has been happening to us with the gridlock that seems to have taken over, at least in Washington, is that people get so scared that something won't work that they don't go forward with anything at all. It's the slippery slope argument. Well, if we do that, then this will happen. And my concept of governance has always been just the way it is true in business and in life, whether it's managing a household budget or a business budget or a government's budget, is that there are always course corrections that are necessary. Conditions change, people change, things don't work the way they're supposed to for a reason that nobody ever anticipated. And you can just go ahead and have confidence that you're going to learn about it and change it. And so that's part of it. And the other part is really working to empower your public employees. You got to give them some freedom, but you also have to provide transparency and accountability, which in today's digital world is easier than it used to be.
So I have a question based on the audience. There's There's a lot of students here. I know several professors have brought their students here. There are a whole number of professors from the McCormick School and elsewhere. And of course, the vision of the McCormick School is to kind of link academia with real world, right? And you talked so eloquently about that vision that your father had and that vision that he lived. And clearly you're living that too. And you touched on this when you mentioned his last class, but I wonder if you were to kind of list the themes that a professor who may or may not have spent any time in public service, but who wants to make sure that the students are imbued with these really important concepts that link the kind of theory with the on the ground, with the theory of policy with the little boy who's going off to school for the first time because of good policy and good public servants. What would your list of kind of themes of a class be?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think the thing I would ask and encourage students to think about is the notion that good policy has to not just work in the abstract, but it has to be something that makes sense to the people who not only are going to be implementing it, but the people whose lives are going to be affected by it. And that means an understanding of where people are and what they think and what makes sense to them, because after all, we live in a representative democracy. Every year in New Hampshire, every fourth grade class in New Hampshire pretty much spends part of their fourth grade social studies year studying New Hampshire state government, and as a result, they come to the State House to tour. They tour the Supreme Court, they tour the State House, they tour our Historical Society, and they come into the governor and executive council's chambers, and if I'm there, I always talk with them. And we always talk about what they think happens in terms of getting a bill passed. We talk a lot about the concept of a majority, which I've learned you best teach to fourth graders by asking them what happens when a baseball game is tied. You know, when the score is 1-1, and then we get to the concept of a majority. But one of the things I always ask them is, if a legislator has an idea for a bill, a proposal for a law, do you think they should be? Do you think they need to be and should be talking to other people about it? And we then get into this concept they're going to have to get a majority of votes. So yeah, they're going to talk to other legislators. And then I say to them, well, who else should they talk to? And we get to the idea that we have hearings in a democracy so that the public can come in and tell us what they think about an idea for a law. And we go over the concept of, you know, who do these legislators and who does the governor represent anyway, and it's all of you. And I think for policymakers, it's really important to figure out what that hearing would sound like, right? Hey, this is what this bill would do. All of you members of the public, come in and tell us. And one of the things I'm proudest of in New Hampshire, you know, we have a volunteer legislature, 424 members, 24 state senators, 400 House members. They all get paid $100 a year. That $100 a year is set in the New Hampshire Constitution from a provision in 1888, and it was never adjusted for inflation. And in that very large volunteer body, we have rules that require that every single bill that is filed have a hearing. So no committee chair can decide that there won't be a hearing. You file a bill, your bill will get a hearing. And even if the committee votes that bill down, it still goes for a full vote on the floor of the legislative chamber. So the transparency is enormous, and the amount of input that the public can have is extraordinary. I think it serves a real purpose. It can be very cumbersome to get 1,000 bills through a 6-month session that way, but it really does get back to this notion that if you're going to implement something, you really should have an understanding of what the people who will be living, because the fourth graders will say it, they'll say, well, we're going to have to live, they'll say, Governor, if you make our school day an hour longer, we have to live with that, you know, and they're right, right? And so do their teachers.
They don't vote, however, so.
So, Governor, you mentioned the state agency folks can be more transparent these days because of new technology. When you think about government and new technology, and we talk about transparency a lot, I actually think that putting on a public intellectual hat, we haven't really thought about the theory of transparency very carefully. But when you think about the America to be, how would you imagine that we could actually use this technology to get more to that vision?
I will start by saying if we want to be able to use that technology effectively and well, just as the private sector is learning to use that technology effectively and well, then we have to invest in that technology. And one of the challenges we have in public life and in the public sector is getting that upfront money to invest in the kind of systems that would in fact allow us to, for instance, let everybody go online and see what the performance metrics for a particular agency are, and then see how we're doing towards them. But that takes a bit of upfront investment, and then it takes somebody to manage not only the technology, but the process that will allow agencies to develop those kinds of performance metrics. And one of the things I think a lot about is it's not just individual performance metrics, but it's a way of engaging the public. And I don't know yet how to do this, but it's something we should all be trying to work towards. When I sat on our State Senate Finance Committee, and as governor, the number of people who come forward to say, if you will invest money in this program or that program, not only will it have a great impact on people who need a particular service or who have a particular kind of challenge, or businesses that want a more responsive government or need help with developing a startup ecosystem, let's say. But they also almost always say, and it will save money in the long run. And we do and I used to finally, I remember saying on Senate Finance at the end of a very long set of budget hearings, everybody says that. You know, we're going to have to find a way to prove the case. And that kind of engaging our constituents seems to me to be something that we really should be able to work on with this technology. We started, you know, we invested X number of dollars in this in, let's say, early childhood education. And we could expect to see, however many years later, fewer children needing special education services in first grade, right? And what's the cost with that? And part of that's about data collection, so we have a control, and gathering data from a disparate group of municipalities, for instance, especially around our school systems and education. And then part of that is about understanding how to use the data and making it available to people in real time.
I have a follow-up question to that, because you, in your descriptions, last question, then we'll go to okay. Because you talked a lot of kind of analytic intensity there. In your roles as a legislator and now as governor, did you lean on the public university system for that kind of analysis? And if so, if not, why not? And then how would you advise a public university like ours that wants to engage with our legislature, our executive branch? What's your experience with that?
So the University of New Hampshire has a wonderful a wonderful set of departments and organizations. The one most relevant to tonight's discussion would be the Carsey Institute, which does an enormously important set of work, especially around poverty and working families in New Hampshire. And so they have been active in providing data. We also have a New Hampshire Center for Public Policy Studies, which has a small staff headed up by one of my dad's students at Wesleyan, which I only discovered after like 2 or 3 years in the state senate, and he came to see me about something, and we started talking, and one thing led to the next, and we realized that he was the same Steve who had had very, very long hair when I had met him at Mom and Dad's house, actually. So we have some kind of independent, not-profit think tanks that are also very helpful. One of the challenges New Hampshire has is that while we have the largest state legislature in the country, it is the largest state legislature in the country with the smallest staff. And we are very proud of that, as we should be. I mean, we are, a volunteer legislature that people kind of go and do their own research and, make their own judgments. But it sometimes means that we are more reliant on people with a vested interest in the outcome for information. And so that's one of the things that a Center for Public Policy Studies, for instance, right in the state's capital helps us avoid.
And you or your staff, I presume, can pick up the phone and
Yeah.
call them and say, hey, we're interested in doing this program that's going to do X, Y, and Z. What's the impact?
Yeah,
gonna be?"
we have the New Hampshire Public Policy Center, and then we also have a group, a center called the New Hampshire Center for Fiscal Policy. So they focus particularly on economic and fiscal policy, which is very helpful. And then the Center for Public Policy Studies tends to do a little bit more programmatic work. Yeah.
Bob.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I think the most democratic way to do this is for people to line up at the central microphone, and the moderator can take the rest of the night off, I guess. And so as you're all clamoring to ask Governor Hassan questions, I'm sure there are some. Where's Leslie? She had a question, I thought. Get up there. And I'm sure others of you will too. I did want to point out that there are some people, everybody's worthy of recognition, but we have some other elected officials besides yourself. Joe Sullivan, who's the mayor of Braintree, and his daughter, Molly, who is a graduate of this very school last year. Stand up. I think Denise Garlick is back there. Hi, Denise. Welcome. You came. State representative in Massachusetts, and her daughter, Monica, who is on our committee. Thank you, Monica. So I'm not sure how much good training we've given you for what might be your next job, because nobody filibustered tonight. and the result is we do have a little time for Q&A from the audience, which is great. I have one other little thing, so nobody gets in the far horizons. There is I have to say, an invitation-only small dinner afterwards for the committee and for some people who knew Bob Wood. And I'm sorry we can't invite everybody, but I only bring it up because one of the members of my committee thought it was somewhere where it isn't. It's right downstairs here, so please don't go flying off if you are coming to the dinner. Okay, that said, time for some questions and answers. Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Governor. We appreciate you being here and for making time to not only honor that legacy, but to continue making those connections between what happens in the community, the state, and the academy. So I'm currently studying the Gender Leadership and Public Policy Program, graduate certificate program in our Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. And I came into the program having worked on the local level, really wanting to better understand how policies are made. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a moment or two for those who maybe cannot yet or maybe don't want to do their learning in a formal way.
Yeah.
How can, what would you recommend for women in particular to become more involved in the policymaking process?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that I think a foundational thing for men and women to understand, but for women in particular, is how important it is to have diversity at the decision-making table. What we now know from research is that whether it's in business or in government, when you have a diversity of perspectives at the decision-making table, the organization just does better. So first of all, I would want women to understand that their participation is really important because the outcome of the process will be better for their participation, simply because they offer a different perspective than the traditional male-dominated system and organizations have. Secondly, I think I would encourage, as I would encourage anyone, get involved in things that you connect with, that are meaningful to you, and that you are passionate about. And often that will lead forward into more and more participation in a broader sense. So I first got involved with our legislature because I began advocating for families like Tom's and mine at the local level, and then gradually realized I needed to go to Concord to talk to decision makers about the budget and how it affected families like ours, and then got appointed to a commission so that I could continue to speak for families like ours in terms of education financing. And as I did that, I began to understand more about the legislative process. I began to realize, because people encouraged me to, that I might be interested in running for office. And like most women, the research shows that most women who run for office need to be asked to run. It's a very interesting dynamic. And so, again, just encouraging women to, if they see a problem, get involved in solving that problem, and that will lead them to learn more about themselves and their capacity to engage and their capacity to lead. Yep. Hi.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you to the panelists as well. It's been a great event. My name is Nolan O'Brien. I'm a senior studying political science here, graduating in just a few months. And my question kind of is a follow-up, but a little bit more on the practical side. So you've had the opportunity to serve in a legislative body and then an executive position and maybe possibly again another legislative body. So could you talk about some of the virtues or maybe the pros and cons of dealing with both types of government?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly, I have loved every single aspect of both the legislative work and the executive work. I will also say that I think in particular New Hampshire being in the legislature was very important preparation for being a public chief executive. And that's partly because the New Hampshire governorship is a consensus building role. Again, a legislature of 424 people, and we have an executive council that also is an elected body that has to weigh in on what contracts we enter into, who my commissioners are. They have a vote on confirming my commissioners. So in that sense, New Hampshire is a very consensus-based state. And so learning how to have your differences with people, but then also come back to the table with them is really important, not just in terms of legislating, but it's a very important thing to do in a state where so many people engage in all decision-making. And, you know, I think what I have loved about being an executive is not only trying to really make sure that we're focused on how we implement and deliver those ideas that got passed by the legislature, because you can see the real impact of doing it well, you can see the real impact of doing it not so well. and then you can take concrete steps to change it. I also really have appreciated and been honored that the people of New Hampshire have trusted me to articulate our goals and our vision that we can all work towards together, and to be able to work with the people of New Hampshire in identifying what our goals should be and what our priorities should be, and then having the opportunity to not only engage with people about how they think we're doing, but also engage people with each other. The other great thing about being governor in our state is that we have a lot of public-private partnerships, and it's a small state. And so a lot of my work is really realizing that that nonprofit foundation and that legislator need to be talking to each other about early childhood. And gee, if we can't pass full-day kindergarten right now, because for a lot of reasons, but there's a lot of steps we can take to make it more and more available. And those are the kinds of things that a chief executive gets to do simply by the fact that you get a chance to talk with a lot of people and meet them, and then begin to help them take their ideas and match them up with people who can help them implement them. So it's a great job that way. Mostly it's a great job because the people of your state will engage with you and tell you what they care about, and then they'll work like anything to help you to help you solve the problem.
Hi, Maggie. My name is Travis Delaney. I'm an undergraduate here. I'll be graduating in about a month. And my question to you, in the news, and certainly there's this perception that our government and our democracy is being corrupted by special interest groups. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I was looking to work for the government after I graduated, but because of what's been going on in Washington, I've been kind of been disgruntled by the stuff that's been going on, as well as a lot of young people. I think there's a large disconnect. So mm-hmm. My question was, how do you try and re-engage the young people, because I think that's the future of our democracy. Right. And if the young people aren't engaged, I think our democracy is in really deep trouble. So yeah. That's my question.
Well, I thank you for the question, and there is no doubt that we have a lot of work to do. My concern, and one of the reasons I'm running for Senate, is that we have a Washington that has been captured by special interests and a very far-right party leadership. And what I am seeing right now, you can see that play out in a number of arenas, but with the whole refusal of the Republican majority in the Senate to hold hearings on a Supreme Court nomination, you see a system now just dominated by the far right of that party and the special interests who back them. And so I certainly understand the frustration that people feel, and I certainly am frustrated myself. There are all sorts of people in my state who we need to be doing better for. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. A school teacher in Manchester, New Hampshire, who told me that after a career of teaching, she can't afford to send her own child to college, right? Or the guy who stops me and says, you've made some progress on roads and bridges, that's good, but boy, I'm a structural engineer, we have a lot of work to do to have a modern and safe transportation infrastructure for our people and our businesses. We have to do better in New Hampshire for the thousands of families across our state who are grappling with the loss of a loved one because of substance abuse. And we have to do better for thousands of women across my state who keep seeing their access to preventive and primary health care threatened by politicians playing games with Planned Parenthood. And so people should be frustrated, and yet they also have a responsibility, we all do, to step up and break through this logjam and solve the problem. That's, in fact, what Americans have to do. We're supposed to do hard stuff. Now, towards that end, we have to reform our campaign finance system. I would vote to overturn Citizens United, but even before getting there, thank you, there are things we can do in terms of disclosure of who's funding super PACs, for instance, and all this shadow money, Citizens United actually said that you can require disclosure from these groups. Congress just has chosen not to do it. So we have work to do, and we have to recognize that campaign finance reform is part of it, but you also have to have electeds who care more about their constituents than they care about special interests. And there are certainly electeds among us who say no to special interests. And we have to make sure we elect them, and people who know that they can be a voice for the people in their communities need to run for office. And that's the other thing I would encourage young people to do. I think it can seem like a very foreign system, and I really would encourage people to find out how you run for office, whether it's as a Board of Selectmen or a Conservation Commission, which are very common in my state, or a Board of Aldermen or state rep. There are ways you can make a difference, but you got to be willing to engage. And the alternative, when you don't engage, is that those special interests will come into the vacuum, and they will dominate. And it is possible to have a democracy that speaks for the people of our country, and it's going to be up to young people to help us make sure that it continues.
Hello, Governor Hassan. Thank
Howard.
you for your great words this evening. They're very inspirational. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm an associate professor here in the McCormick Graduate School. I have a question about political disagreements. There is a candidate for president who has asserted that supporters in the opposing party have been essentially deluded by the political culture, and that if only the facts were known, that many of these people in the opposing party would not take the positions that they do. The percentage might be very low. There's a counter argument that says that across ideological or partisan divides, many people have sincere and deeply held beliefs that are not only the product of misinformation or lack of knowledge. So given these two understandings of where partisan or ideological divides come from and how they might be remedied, how can you recommend that diverse constituencies work together?
Thank you for the question. I think it is important, and this is one of the things that I think is easy for people to miss who don't engage in the political process. It is important for people to understand that your friends and neighbors in the same communities as you can have very different beliefs than you do, and that sometimes people disagree with us, you, each other, because they disagree and they're different people. And what I've always found is that you have to hear each other out. There are some people who have such divergent beliefs about certain issues that you're not going to find common ground, at least on that issue, with that person. But you are going to find people who are problem solvers, who understand that their belief can't just be the only one at the table in order to solve a problem and move forward. So you look for people who will agree with you about what the challenge or problem is to solve, and then be willing to find ways to compromise to get there. Understanding that on some issues, you just may not agree. You also do need to spend a lot of time helping somebody you're trying to work with understand why you think what you do, and they need to help you understand why they think the way they do. And one of the things, an example I will give is on our challenge right now in New Hampshire, and Massachusetts is facing the same one. A lot of communities around the country are. We have both a real challenge around how we care for people with mental illness and how we deal with our substance abuse epidemic. And I think it is fair to say that a year ago, there were differing opinions in various stakeholder groups and subsets in our state capital about what the cause of the issue was, and about how you might go about addressing it. People still will put different emphasis in that discussion on some of the different factors, and we all know it's a multifaceted problem, our heroin and opioid epidemic, for instance. But I think as we have gained a common understanding of what the actual multifaceted causes are, it has enabled us to get over some preconceived ideas. And the most important thing that we have all been getting over together is the stigma that came with addiction and came with mental illness historically. And as we have begun to understand mental illness and addiction as a disease, and understand how much we would want a loved one who suffers from that disease to be able to get appropriate treatment and to be able to engage in long-term recovery, we have been making some good progress on really addressing the issue. So that's an example. I don't know that it answers your question perfectly, but it takes getting to know people at some level and just talking with them a lot about all sorts of things, so that when, another example I'll give is I've had colleagues from the opposite party in our state Senate, and you sit together and you spend time together in the chamber listening to bills and listening to debates, and you begin to know something about the person and their family and their beliefs and their work life and all of those kinds of things. And it does enable you, when you get to a difficult discussion, to trust that the other person's values and purposes are similar to yours. And the thing I wish in this election season we could all come back to is the fact that we are all Americans, and we have all been charged with that basic American job of building progress each generation to include more and more people, so that that original challenge, that original notion that everybody counts, is honored. And if we can remember that our ancestors were willing to fight for and with each other to further that goal, then I think we can all come together to do that too. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Governor. We all understand, if we didn't a few minutes ago, why this lectureship and the memory of your father is so important to us, and we do hope you will come back next year. We promise not to work you so hard. Thanks so much. Thank you all.